The Great Hall of the Galactic Council floated in space like a frozen jewel. It orbited Verath Prime, a pale blue world that nobody actually lived on anymore. The hall had been built 300 years ago, and every wall was covered in the symbols of 47 species. Every chair at the long, curved table was filled. Every eye in the room was pointed at one person. Carol Simmons stood alone. She was not tall. She was not dressed in anything impressive. She wore a simple, dark suit, the kind a person might wear to an important meeting back on Earth. Her brown hair was pulled back neatly. Her hands were folded in front of her. She looked calm, but if anyone had been close enough, they would have seen that her jaw was set very tight. Behind her, a gallery of alien observers filled row after row of seats. Reporters from dozens of species held recording devices. Diplomats whispered to each other. A few of them looked almost sorry. Most of them just looked curious, the way people look when they are watching something bad happen to someone else. Speaker Vorath stood at the head of the table. He was tall and gray-skinned, with long fingers that he kept pressed flat against the surface in front of him. His species, the Velthari, had helped found the council over 2 centuries ago. He had been speaker for 30 years. He had never looked uncomfortable before. Today, something in his eyes was not quite right. He began to speak in the common tongue, and the translation system carried his words clearly to every ear in the room. He said that the council had reviewed the case of Earth's membership for 3 years. He said that the hearings had been thorough and fair. He listed the charges slowly, one by one, and each one landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Humanity was unpredictable. Humanity acted on emotion rather than logic. Humanity had interfered in 3 separate diplomatic negotiations between council members without invitation. Humanity had refused to share full data on its military development program. Humanity was, in the judgment of the council, a destabilizing presence that threatened the careful order the galaxy had maintained for generations. Then Vorath said the final words. Earth was hereby removed from the Galactic Council. All formal trade agreements were suspended immediately. No member species was permitted to engage in military cooperation with humanity. Any species found providing technology assistance to Earth would face a full review of their own membership status. The hall was quiet. Carol did not move. She stood with her hands still folded, her eyes on Vorath, and she waited until he was completely finished. Then she asked, in a level voice, if she was permitted to respond. Vorath nodded. Carol took one slow breath. She looked around the room at all the faces watching her, and she began to speak. She said she would not argue with the verdict. She said she understood that the council believed it was doing the right thing. She said she had sat in this hall for 2 years trying to explain humanity, and she had come to understand that the problem was not a lack of explanation. The problem was that the council had already decided what humanity was before she ever walked through the door. She paused for a moment. Then she said very clearly and without any anger in her voice, "You have made a mistake. We will show you why." She picked up the small case beside her feet, turned around, and walked out of the hall. The gallery erupted the moment the doors closed behind her. Back on Earth, it was early morning on the East Coast when the broadcast cut in. People were eating breakfast, getting children ready for school, sitting in early traffic. The words crossed every screen, every feed, every public display simultaneously. Earth has been removed from the Galactic Council. The reactions came fast and loud. Protests started within hours in major cities. Some crowds were angry, throwing things and shouting at government buildings. Some crowds just stood quietly in the streets, looking up at the sky as if they expected something to fall from it. Markets dropped sharply before trading was suspended. 3 separate colony stations on Mars and Europa went to emergency protocol and sealed their outer airlocks as a precaution, though nobody actually expected an attack. President Leon Carter was already awake. He had known the verdict before it was announced publicly. He sat in his office for a long time after the call came in, not speaking, just looking at the small model of a spacecraft that sat on the corner of his desk. His chief of staff stood near the door and wisely said nothing. After a while, Carter stood up and told his team to prepare a broadcast. In a small workshop on the outskirts of Houston, a young woman named Dana Wells had fallen asleep in her chair sometime around 3 in the morning. She woke up when her screen started flashing with the alert. She read the headline. She sat still for a while thinking. Then she looked around at the half-built engine component on her workbench, at the sketches pinned to the wall above it, at the shelf of technical manuals she had read so many times the spines were cracked and soft. She said quietly to no one, "Good. Now we build." That evening, Carter addressed the planet. His speech was not long. He did not use words like revenge or war. He spoke about what humanity had always done when a door was closed in its face. He spoke about every time in history when people had been told they were not welcome somewhere and had responded by creating something that could not be ignored. He said humanity would not chase a seat at someone else's table. He said the plan was called Project Horizon. He said nothing more about what it meant that night. But the people listening felt something shift, something quiet and serious, the way the air changes just before a storm begins to build. They were not easy years. The first 2 were the hardest. When the trade agreements collapsed, certain materials became difficult to get. Medical supplies that had come from Droon traders disappeared from shelves. Rare metals used in ship construction stopped arriving. Some smaller colonies went through periods of genuine shortage, and there were months when the mood on Earth was heavy and uncertain. But something unexpected happened during those hard months. People stopped arguing about the small things. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment when every nation decided to work together. It happened slowly, the way a tide comes in, quietly and without announcement. A government that had refused to share energy technology for decades quietly sent the files to 3 neighboring countries. A long border dispute between 2 nations was settled in a single afternoon meeting because both sides suddenly had bigger things to think about. Aid moved between countries faster than it ever had before. Old rivalries did not disappear, but they became much less important when everyone was facing the same problem from the same direction. Ray Okafor noticed it before most people did. He was a tall, calm man from Lagos who had spent 20 years working in space logistics before President Carter pulled him in and gave him the job of building something that had never existed before. The Sovereign Space Authority had started with a budget, an empty office building, and exactly 11 employees. Ray hired carefully and slowly, looking not just for people who were brilliant, but for people who could work alongside anyone without letting pride get in the way. Within 3 years, the SSA had over 40,000 people working under it, drawn from every continent on Earth and every major colony in the solar system. Its motto, painted on the wall of the main operations floor in plain letters, read, "Not invited, not stopped." Ray believed in simple things: clear goals, honest communication, no wasted time. He ran the SSA the way he had once run a shipping operation on Mars, which was to say he ran it like every hour had a cost, and every delay was a choice someone made. The people who worked for him respected him without fearing him, which was exactly what he wanted. Dana Wells had been one of his earliest calls. She had not been famous when Ray found her. She was known in certain engineering circles for a paper she had written on modular ship architecture, the idea that a vessel should be designed the way a good tool is designed, able to be taken apart, repaired with whatever materials were available, and put back together differently if the mission changed. Most people in the field had read the paper and nodded and then gone back to designing ships the traditional way. Ray had read it and called her the next morning. Dana was 31 years old when she was given command of the Anchor Point 1 project. She was not the most experienced person in the room for most of the early meetings. She knew that. She did not pretend otherwise. What she was, and what everyone around her quickly understood, was that she saw problems from angles other people missed, and she did not stop working until the problem was solved, or she had proven clearly that it could not be solved, which almost never happened. Anchor Point 1 was being built in the asteroid belt, far enough from Earth to be difficult to observe from a distance, and surrounded by enough natural cover that long-range scans from Council territory gave blurry and incomplete readings. This was intentional. Ray had been very clear from the beginning that humanity was not going to announce what it was building until the building was done. The shipyard grew in sections. The first ring of the structure went up in 14 months, which was faster than anyone had planned. The second and third rings followed. Workshops expanded outward from the central spine like branches. Living quarters were added because people were staying longer and longer and eventually just stopped going home. A small school opened in the third year because some of the engineers had children, and there was no good reason to send them back to Earth when everything they needed was already here. Dana's ships were unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever produced. Council vessels were built for permanence and power. They were large and heavily armored and slow to change. Dana's designs worked on a different idea entirely. Her ships were built in sections that could be reconfigured in the field. A cargo bay could become a medical unit. A weapons bay could be converted into a laboratory. The outer hull used layered materials that could be partially replaced without dry dock access. She called them flexible vessels, but the crews who flew the early test models called them living ships, because they felt like something that adapted rather than something that simply endured. The first full vessel rolled out of the yard on a quiet morning in late spring, measured by Earth's calendar. It was not a warship. Dana had been firm about that from the first sketch. It was designated a deep explorer, and its name was painted along its side in clean, simple letters: Horizon's Edge. About 3,000 people were gathered at the viewing platform when it launched. The ship moved out of the yard slowly, its lights coming on one section at a time as systems activated in sequence. It turned toward open space with a steadiness that made several experienced engineers go very quiet. Ray stood beside Dana on the platform. He said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Dana watched the ship until it was a small, bright point against the dark, and then slightly smaller, and then gone. She was not a person who cried easily, and she did not cry then, but she pressed her lips together very hard for a moment and looked at the floor. Ray noticed. He said nothing about it. What he did say after a long pause was, "One down." Dana looked up at him. Then she smiled, just slightly, and said, "A few hundred to go." Nina Lawson had a talent for walking into rooms where she was not wanted and leaving them with something she had not arrived with. She was 34 years old, originally from Atlanta, and she had spent the first 10 years of her career working in conflict resolution between human nations. She understood how to listen without showing what she was thinking. She understood how to find the thing a person actually wanted underneath the thing they were saying out loud. Ray had recommended her to President Carter after watching her resolve a 3-year resource dispute between 2 colony stations in under a week, mostly by asking questions and letting the 2 sides talk themselves into an agreement they had been too proud to reach on their own. Carter gave her a small team, a fast ship, and a very short set of instructions. Find the species the Council has been ignoring. Talk to them. Listen more than you speak. Nina had been doing exactly that for 3 years before anyone outside of the SSA knew her name. Her first real breakthrough came on a Droon trade station called Vesa Mora, a crowded and loud place that smelled of fuel and something sweet that nobody could identify. The Droon were insectoid, with 6 limbs and large amber eyes that caught light in a way that made them look permanently alert. They were extraordinary traders, capable of calculating complex exchange rates faster than most computer systems. But the Council had spent decades steering large contracts toward its favored species and leaving the Droon to work the smaller and less profitable routes. The High Merchant of Vesa Mora was named Kalavesh. He received Nina in a small room behind the main trading floor, surrounded by stacks of data tablets and 2 assistants who watched her with open suspicion. He told her plainly that he had heard humans were building something in the asteroid belt, and that he was not interested in being part of whatever trouble humanity was preparing to cause. Nina did not argue with him. She asked him instead to tell her about the last time the Council had given the Droon a fair contract on a major trade route. Kalavesh was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked for a long time. Nina listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she slid a single document across the table. It was a proposed trade agreement between humanity and the Droon. It was 4 pages long. There were no hidden terms, no clauses buried in small text, no conditions that would shift after signing. She told him to read it, take as long as he needed, show it to whoever he trusted, and then tell her what he thought. He read it twice in front of her. Then he looked up and said that there had to be something wrong with it because no agreement this simple had ever been offered to his people by anyone with any power. Nina said that was exactly the problem they were trying to fix. Kalavesh signed 3 days later. The Savari homeworld was different. It was a warm planet with wide, shallow seas and dense forest covering most of the land. The Savari were reptilian, patient, and quiet, with a long history of careful observation and very little history of trust in outsiders. They had applied for council membership 4 times over the past century and been denied each time on technical grounds that everyone understood were not really technical. Elder Rock received Nina in an open courtyard under a pale sky. He was old, with scales that had faded to a soft gray at the edges, and he moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp. He had been leading his people for 30 years, and he was tired in the way that leaders get tired when they have been fighting for recognition that never comes. Nina's team had arrived 3 days before her meeting with Rock. They had brought medical supplies targeted specifically to 3 diseases that were common among the Savari and difficult to treat with local resources. They had brought 2 engineers who spent those 3 days helping repair a water filtration system in the nearest city that had been broken for 2 years. They had brought teachers who sat with Savari children and simply talked with them, answered questions, showed them images of Earth and Mars and the shipyard at Anchor Point 1. When Nina finally sat across from Rock, he looked at her for a long time before he spoke. He said he had been waiting to see what humans would ask for in return for what they had already given. Nina said the supplies and the repairs were not a negotiation tool. They were just what you did when someone needed help, and you had the ability to help them. Rock was quiet for a while after that. Then, slowly, his expression changed into something that was not quite a smile, because Savari faces did not move that way, but was something close to it. He signed the treaty that afternoon. When the document was complete and the formal words had been spoken, Rock looked at Nina and said, in careful and deliberate common tongue, that his people had waited 100 years for someone to come to them as an equal. He said he was glad it had been humans. Nina kept her expression calm until she was back on her ship. Then she sat in her cabin for a while and did not talk to anyone. The Pelori were the strangest contact of all. They existed as vast, drifting presences in gas clouds, communicating through pressure waves and shifting patterns of light. Most council science teams had visited them once, recorded data, and filed reports describing them as non-sapient or too alien for meaningful communication. Dana had built a specialized vessel for this single meeting, fitted with systems that could generate and read pressure wave patterns across a wide frequency range. The first successful exchange took 6 hours. It was slow and uncertain, and there were long silences where nobody on Nina's team was sure if anything was coming back. Then the patterns shifted in a way the translation system identified as a question. The question, rendered into words as closely as the system could manage, was something like, "You came here to speak with us, not to study us?" Nina responded through the system, "Yes." The Pelori response took a long time to translate. When it came through, it read, "Then you are different from the others." By the time Nina returned to Anchor Point 1 with signed agreements from 14 species, Ray was waiting for her at the dock. He looked at the documents she handed him and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We have an alliance." Nina nodded. She looked tired, but her eyes were steady. She said, "Now we need to make sure it means something." Ray was asleep when his comm unit activated. He had learned years ago to sleep lightly, the way people learn when they have carried responsibility for long enough that the weight of it follows them even into rest. He was sitting up and reading before his aide finished speaking. A Galactic Council warship had fired on a Savari transport vessel inside IGC-recognized space. The transport had been carrying trade goods and 23 passengers. The Council ship had claimed afterward that it was a navigation error, that its targeting systems had malfunctioned, that the discharge had been unintentional. 11 Sevari had been killed. Among them was the youngest son of Elder Rock. Ray sat with that information for a long moment. Then he got dressed and went to the operations floor. By the time he arrived, Dana was already there. She had not been sleeping. She was standing at the main display with a cup of cold coffee in her hand, looking at the incident report with the particular stillness she had when something had made her very angry and she was working to keep it contained. She looked at Ray when he walked in and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say yet. Carol Simmons sent a formal protest to the Council within the hour. The response came back in less than a day, which was fast by Council standards, and told Ray that they had prepared the response in advance. The language was careful and distant. The Council expressed regret for the incident. It offered a review process that would take between 18 and 24 months to complete. It did not acknowledge any fault. It did not use the word apology anywhere in the document. Ray read it once and set it down. He called a full IGC military council the next morning. Every member species with vessels capable of defense sent their senior commanders to the meeting, either in person or through secure transmission. The room was crowded, and the mood was not calm. The Sevari representative, a young officer named Kess, who had trained with human crews at Anchor Point 1, sat very straight and very still throughout the entire meeting and did not speak unless spoken to. Ray laid out the situation plainly. The Council had crossed into IGC space and killed civilians. Whether it was intentional or not, the result was the same, and the response told them everything they needed to know about how the Council intended to handle accountability. He said the IGC had two choices. It could accept the review process and wait 2 years for a conclusion that would almost certainly change nothing. Or it could respond in a way that made clear the IGC was not something the Council could simply push against without consequence. He was careful about what he said next. He said the response would not be an attack. It would not target civilians. It would not be hidden or carried out in the dark. Every action the IGC fleet took would be broadcast openly on every available frequency so that the entire galaxy could watch and judge for itself. Dana had been working through the night before the meeting. She stood up and walked the Council through the current state of the IGC fleet. 61 vessels in total. 15 of them were her latest design, the Horizon class, which were faster than anything the Council currently operated at their size, and equipped with the adaptive shielding system she had finished developing 8 months earlier. She explained the shielding simply. It read, incoming weapon patterns during the first exchange, and adjusted its layering in real time to reduce the effectiveness of repeated fire from the same source. It was not perfect. Nothing was perfect. But it meant that a Council ship could not simply keep firing the same weapon at a Horizon-class vessel and expect the same result twice. The Droon commander, a sharp-eyed officer named Veth Kala, who was Kalavesh's niece, said that the Droon had 12 fast traders retrofitted for combat support. She said her people were ready. She said this without drama, in the same tone someone might use to confirm a delivery schedule. The fleet moved 3 days later. It took up position along the boundary of IGC space at a point that placed it directly between the likely Council approach vector and the nearest Sevari settlement. Ray had chosen the location deliberately. They were not advancing into Council space. They were standing in their own. The Council fleet appeared on long-range sensors 14 hours after the IGC reached position. 40 ships. It was a serious number, larger than what would be sent for a simple patrol, and Ray noted it without comment. He had expected something like this. The Council wanted to see if the IGC would move. The IGC did not move. When the two fleets were close enough for direct communication, the Council commander opened a channel. His name was Drouth, a Veltari officer with a hard voice and the kind of deliberate slowness in his speech that was meant to signal authority. He told the IGC fleet that it was operating in a disputed region and that it should withdraw immediately to avoid an escalation that nobody wanted. Ray took the channel himself. He looked at the screen for a moment before he spoke. Then he said in a voice that was calm and unhurried and carried clearly across every open frequency the IGC was broadcasting on. "We are standing exactly where we have the right to stand." Drouth said nothing for several seconds. The two fleets held position. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 4. The IGC crews did not speak much during those hours. Dana moved between stations on the command ship, checking systems, saying quiet words to the engineers monitoring the adaptive shielding array. Kess, the young Severi officer, stood at his post without moving for the entire duration. At the 6-hour mark, the Council fleet began to withdraw. It was slow, and it was done without any communication. The 40 ships simply turned and moved back toward Council space in formation, and within 2 hours they were off the IGC's long-range sensors entirely. Nobody cheered on the command ship. The silence was not the silence of people who felt nothing. It was the silence of people who understood what had just happened and did not want to make it smaller by celebrating too loudly. Ray stood at the main window and watched the empty space where the Council fleet had been. Behind him, Dana said quietly, "They came to see if we would blink." Ray nodded slowly. She said, "Now they know." Across the galaxy, on a station orbiting the Council's home world, Speaker Vorath sat alone in a dark room and watched the full broadcast replay from beginning to end. His long fingers were pressed flat on the table in front of him, the same way they had been on the day he read the verdict against Earth years ago. But something about them looked different now. They looked less certain. When the replay ended, he sat for a long time without moving. Then he said to his aide, in a voice that was very quiet, "We should not have banished them." Carol Simmons was in the middle of a routine briefing when her senior aide placed a single printed document on the table in front of her and stepped back without saying anything. Carol looked at the aide's expression, then looked down at the document. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. It was from the Galactic Council. It was addressed to her personally. It was written in careful, formal language that took a long time to say something very simple. The Council wished to open a private discussion about the possibility of restoring Earth's membership. The offer was quiet. There was no press announcement attached to it. There was no public statement. The Council wanted this handled in a way that nobody outside of a very small group would know about until an agreement was already reached. Carol set the document down and looked out the window for a while. Then she called Ray. Ray read it and said it was what he had expected eventually. He asked her what she thought. Carol said she thought it deserved to go before the full IGC assembly because it was not just Earth's decision anymore. Ray agreed. The assembly met 4 days later. It was the largest gathering the IGC had held since its formation. Every member species sent representatives. The hall at Anchor Point 1 had been expanded twice since the early days, and it was still crowded. The air in the room had the particular feeling of a moment that people understood they would remember for a long time. Carol presented the Council's offer clearly and without added opinion. She read the relevant sections aloud, answered questions from several representatives, and then opened the floor for discussion. The debate that followed lasted most of the day. Some representatives argued for accepting. The Council still controlled significant resources and trade infrastructure. Returning to membership would give humanity and its partners access to networks that the IGC had been building around, but not through. The practical benefits were real, and it would be foolish to ignore them out of pride. Others disagreed. The Droon commander Veth Kala said plainly that the Council had ignored her people for generations, and that a private offer delivered quietly through the back door was not the same thing as genuine change. The Savari representative Kess said almost nothing during the debate, but when he did speak, he said only that Elder Rock had asked him to remind the Assembly what the Council's last direct action toward the Savari had cost them. The room was quiet after that for a while. Dana spoke near the end of the debate. She was not a diplomat, and she did not try to sound like one. She stood up and said what she thought in the direct way she always had. She said that humanity had been thrown out of a room and told it was not good enough. She said that instead of standing outside that room waiting to be let back in, they had gone and built something larger and better and full of people who had chosen to be there. She said accepting the council's offer now, quietly, with no public acknowledgement of what had been done or what it had cost, felt like walking back into that room and pretending none of it had happened. She said, "We did not build all of this just to hand it over and go back to being one vote among 47. The room was still when she sat down. Carol let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said there was one more option on the table, one that had not been in the original discussion, but that she believed deserved consideration. She had drafted it herself over the past 3 days. She presented it simply. The IGC would not request to rejoin the Galactic Council. Instead, the IGC would formally invite the Galactic Council to apply for observer status within the IGC structure. The same status, Carol noted without expression, that the Council had once assigned to minor species it barely paid attention to. The room took a moment to understand what she had said. Then Vethkala made a sound that her translation unit rendered as a laugh. Kes looked at Carol for a long time, and then dipped his head in the slow, deliberate way that meant deep respect among the Savari. Several other representatives began speaking at once. The vote was not unanimous, but it was clear. The IGC sent the counteroffer to the Council that evening. What followed was 3 weeks that Ray later described as the most interesting period of his career. The Council's internal communications were not accessible to the IGC, but the effects of whatever was happening inside were visible from the outside. 2 Council members went publicly silent. 3 others made statements that carefully avoided confirming their support for the current Council leadership. Diplomatic traffic between Council worlds increased sharply and then dropped off just as sharply. On the 19th day, the first formal resignation came. A mid-sized species called the Harani, who had been council members for 80 years, announced they were withdrawing their membership and submitting an application to the IGC. By the end of the week, 8 more had followed. The council did not collapse. It was still there, still operating, still holding authority over a significant portion of the galaxy. But it was smaller and quieter, and the certainty it had always projected was gone in a way that everyone could see and nobody could put back. On a morning about a month after the resignations, Dana was alone at the wide observation window of Anchor Point 1. The station had grown so much from its original design that sometimes she walked through sections of it and felt like a visitor in her own work. The permanent population was over 40,000 now. There were children who had been born here and had never lived anywhere else. A new ship was being finished in the yard below. It was large and smooth and moved slowly in the dock lights as the final exterior work was completed. It carried no weapon. Dana had designed it herself, in the evenings after her other work was done, over the course of about 2 years. It was a school ship. It would travel between member species and carry their children together, teach them alongside each other, let them grow up knowing that the galaxy was full of people worth knowing. Her comm unit activated. It was Carol. Carol asked her in a quiet and genuine way if she had any regrets about any of it. About the years of work, the hard months at the beginning, the standoff, all of it. Dana looked at the school ship sitting in the yard below her. She thought about Elder Rock signing a document in an open courtyard under a pale sky. She thought about the Pelori asking through a translation system if humans had come to speak with them or study them. She thought about the morning horizon's edge had moved out of the yard and become a small, bright point in the dark. She said, "They threw us out so we would fail quietly. We built an empire instead, and the best part is nobody had to die for it." Carol did not respond right away. When she did, she said simply, "No, nobody did." Dana kept looking at the school ship for a long time after the call ended. Outside the window, the yard was busy and bright, and the work continued, the way it always had, the way she expected it always would.